You think you're ready to show your track? Join the forum at www.artfxstudios.com/forum.
Hey guys, welcome back to ARTFX Tutorial Tuesday. Today I want to talk about the last step in finishing the track, the mastering process. It took a while to make this video, but that is because I've been a bit sick in the last couple of weeks, making it almost impossible to work on the tutorials. So first I want to talk about the last video, which seemed to receive some negative comments about the fact I was using the normalize function on the exports, since mastering engineers will ask for a non-normalized track, right? Well, indeed, a mastering engineer wants a track that is not normalized, but with that they mean they want a track with enough headroom to do the mastering. There is no problem normalizing the individual exports, since what the normalizing does is just bringing up the volume to the 0 dB mark, nothing more. And even if it will introduce some digital distortion, it's not that bad either, since we are making pretty aggressive music which already has a pretty distorted sound. I wouldn't use it when I'm mixing a piano tune, for instance. So I normalized everything first, but afterwards I bring the volumes back down again. The thing a mastering engineer is talking about is only referring to the final export you send him before mastering, which should have about 6 dB of headroom, and if you followed along you could see that it is exactly what I'm doing. So that being said, time to move on to the tutorial. Okay, so at this point you don't want to have any effects on your master track. Don't freak out, because I have already an effect loaded on there, since this is just a VST by Voxengo which records the final output of Ableton to an audio file, just for recording purposes. Okay, so the first thing I'll use on the master track is a compressor to glue everything together. You can use Ableton's stock compressor for this, but I'm going to use a third-party compressor by Cytomic called The Glue. The Glue comes with some great presets which give you a very good starting point for things like gluing tracks together. So as you can see, it comes with a shitload of presets, some for drum processing and vocal processing, but also some for mastering. I'm looking for the ones that say mastering transparent final master and mastering the glue 1 and 2. I normally use one of these as a starting point on my master track. So let's choose the transparent final master to begin with. This is a very simple yet very powerful compressor plugin. At the top you'll see the gain reduction meter in an old school VU style look. You can see that the compressor is being triggered very slightly, since the gain reduction meter is just above the 0 dB mark. So if I move it over to the drop section, you can see I'm triggering only 1 to 2 dB of gain reduction max, but the compression is really gluing the sounds together. If you listen very closely, you can hear the low end just got a bit more solid. I will at this point check out the other two presets I've just talked about, namely the glue 1 and 2, just to see which one sounds the best from the start. Then I'll use that one to build upon. So the glue 1 and 2 actually makes everything a bit louder than the final transparent master preset, but they also glue everything together very nicely. They both bring out the low frequencies a bit more than the final transparent master. So I'll stick with one of the glue presets instead. Let's take the glue 1, since it leaves us with about 5 dB of headroom. So that means that the compressor increased the overall volume with about 1 dB. So I can take that away by working with the makeup gain setting on the compressor. Turn it down and you'll get back some of your headroom. So let me talk you through the settings of this. If you use the Ableton stock compressor, you can sort of mimic this compression preset. So the threshold is set to a low amount, about 4 to 5 dB. The range is set to -17 dB, which basically is another control to control the amount of compression. This parameter is not implemented in the Ableton compressor, but it's not really needed either. The makeup gain is set to about 4 dB, so it brings the volume back up to where it used to be before the compression. I use a very short attack, so the compressor reacts instantly to the transients of the drums and other sounds, but the release is set to the auto mode, so it analyzes the input signal and then adjusts the release time accordingly. Finally, I have the ratio set to 2 to 1, which means that for every 2 dB or signal goes over the threshold setting, it will reduce the volume by 1 dB. Then another cool setting inside Tomic the Glue is that it contains a dry-wet mix knob. So you can mix the compressed and the original signal back together to make the compression a little bit more transparent. If you want to mimic this effect with Ableton's stock compressor, you have to set this up using an audio effect rack using 2 chains, a dry one and a compressed one. Then you can use the chain volumes to mix the two together. The dry wet is set to about 65%, which means that 65% of the signal is coming from the compressor and 35% is the dry signal. The last option is not that much needed, but I'll explain it anyway. The Glue has a built-in high-pass filter, which you can use to high-pass the compressed signal, so that it leaves the low sub-frequencies unaffected. Using this will really make the low frequency stand out, and again, this is easily recreated using the audio effect rack in Ableton. The high-pass is set to 72 Hz. So that was it for the compression. Now it's time to move on to the actual mastering process. For all my mastering jobs, I use a plugin by iZotope called Ozone 5. Ozone 5 is, in my point of view, the most versatile plugin for mastering. Ever since I started using it, I fell in love with its functionality and sound. So when starting the plugin for the first time, it might look a bit complicated, but believe me, it's not. Right here at the bottom, you can see the individual modules used inside Ozone 5, and you can turn each one on and off on their own. So the first one I'll use is the Stereo Imager. I always use this one on my final masters when doing electronic music, and I'll show you why. Electronic music tends to be made for club and party purposes, so you want the main part of the track to be purely in the center of the stereo spectrum. Of course, we already did this when producing, right? The main drums are in the center, just like the bass and the sub-bass. So the cool thing about this plugin is that it gives you 4 individual bands to play with. So let's solo the sub-bass band and look at the stereo information. This should be totally centered. So as you can see, it's almost entirely centered, but some little stereo spikes occur every now and then. So I can take the stereo slider for the sub-band all the way down to make this mono. And as you can see in the stereo graph, it is mono now. Here I can also see that the overall track is pretty much filled out nicely in the stereo spectrum. If your track only shows stuff going on in the middle of the graph, you know you are doing things wrong. So right here above the output volume meter, it shows you the peak level, and below that the RMS level. These two are very important. The peak level is obviously the maximum volume the track is peaking at, while the RMS level is the average perceived loudness of a track. A value closer to 0 means the perceived loudness is loud and has little to no dynamics, while further away from the 0 dB mark, it means you'll have plenty of dynamics but the perceived loudness is lower. You want to find a good balance between those depending on the genre of music you're making. Acoustic music will have a much lower RMS level than a loud electronic music track, for instance. So the next thing I want to talk about is the harmonic exciter. This one is very good for shaping the harmonics in your track, as well as adding a slightly digital distortion to the signal to fatten things up a bit. Again, this one is multi-banded, so you can really sculpt your sound with this. So to start, this harmonic exciter has multiple modes to choose from, with warm being the most transparent and tube being the most noticeable. So let's start with soloing the sub-band, selecting the warm mode and then turning up the amount. You can see more harmonics start to appear, but they are very quiet. If we switch the mode to retro, the harmonics become more defined, and the same happens when switching to the next modes. With this harmonic exciter you can easily make the sub-bass a lot more audible on smaller speakers by introducing more harmonics, although you might want to keep the balance so that it doesn't muddies up the final track. So be very careful with this, don't add too much or it'll destroy the sound. So my favorite mode is the tape mode, which basically emulates the digital distortion you get when recording to analog tape. Okay, so for this, the best thing to do is to work from right to left. So start with the high frequency band and work your way down the frequency spectrum. I found that doing it this way gives a much better result since you focus on the sub-frequencies at the end, thus keeping things clean in context with the upper frequencies. So the most important part now is setting the crossover points between the bands. The upper ones are not that important, but the crossover point between the sub and the low mids is very important. I like to set it at 100 Hz, and I'll do the same for the sub band in the stereo imaging module, just to keep things the same a bit. Now with the exciter turned to the tape mode, I can start adding in some harmonics starting with the highest band. So if I turn up the amount on the high band, you can hear the track becomes more fuzzy and has more background noise. All the way is obviously too much, but keeping it around 2 sounds pretty good. It brings out the white noise and the hi-hats a bit more, making them clearer in the mix. It also helps the main kick and snare to punch through a bit more by adding some more upper harmonics to them. Next, the high mids only need a tiny bit, since those are already filled out pretty well. By adding too much harmonics, your track will sound thin and lose its weight. The low mids will be around the same area as the high mids, since this area is already filled out properly, just like the high mids. Too much in this frequency area will make the track sound muddy. Then again, the sub-band is going to be a little bit higher again, so that the sub-frequencies become more audible on low-quality speakers. So now our volume has increased, but the overall mix became a lot clearer too. A good thing to do is turn off the exciter, play the track and then turn the exciter back on to see how it affected the final sound. If it becomes worse, then just take everything back down and do it all over again. When you've done this right, the exciter will make your track stand out a bit more. Now finally you can use the mix dials to blend the harmonics a bit more with the original signal, sort of like a dry-wet control. This way you can make the individual bands a bit more transparent and make the exciting a little bit less prominent. The difference will be very minimal, and for someone without a trained hearing, they wouldn't even hear the difference. So this step can be left alone if you want. Okay, so the next part would in most cases be the multiband dynamics module, which basically is a multiband compressor. I'm not going to use this though, since I compress my tracks while producing the track, leaving me with an already pretty compressed mixdown. Then afterwards I use the cytomic declue for my master compression, so it's not needed to add an additional compressor. You end up totally squashing the track and you'll lose all the dynamics, which is not what I want. So going back to the stereo imaging module, I can now widen the high frequencies just a little bit. This will bring out the white noise and hi-hats even more by separating them from the main drums and other centered sounds. So now I want to show you some tricks I've learned throughout the years about iZotope's Parametric Equalizer. You can use this to sculpt the sound in a way a lot of people don't know. Note that I'm not going to drastically change the sound, I'll just build upon what I have to make it even better. So at the bottom of the EQ you can find this dial which you can use to switch between the 3 different EQ modes. One is the normal stereo setting which affects the entire track. The other ones are the mid-side mode, which lets you control the centered signal independently from the sides of the stereo spectrum, and the left and right mode, which lets you alter the left and right channels independently. For this one I'll use the mid-side mode. Now you can see these 2 buttons called mid and side became active and I can use them to switch between them. Let's start by switching to the side mode. Now I'll widen up the high frequencies even more by selecting 0.8 on the EQ, then dial in a 1 dB boost at the bottom. Okay, so that was a bit too much. Let's make it a boost of only 0.5 dB, which is very minimal, but it will make a difference in the end. Note that this is different from the stereo imaging and the harmonic exciter, since you only increase the high frequencies in the sides of the stereo spectrum, leaving the centered sounds like they are. This will widen your track up a bit more. So now I'm going to do a similar thing to the low and sub frequencies. First, while still in the side mode, I select EQ 0.1 and drop it 0.5 dB. This will reduce the amount of sub and low frequencies on the sides of the stereo spectrum. There aren't that much of these at the sides anyway, but the frequencies who are there will be a bit less prominent. Now I'll switch to the mid section and do the same. But this time I'll give the sub and low mids a boost of 0.5 dB. Doing this will make the sub and low frequencies sound more centered and more as one solid sound. It will give the track a bit more weight if done properly. Note that the difference is so small that on bad speakers you'll probably not even hear the difference, but on a big club system it's definitely gonna be audible. The low and sub frequencies will be a lot more heavy. So now there's one more step to take, bringing the level up to 0 dB. For this I'll use the maximizer, so I turn it on now. The maximizer is a very powerful limiter, but you have to know how to use it. First we need to choose the right mode for the maximizer. There are multiple to choose from. The hard mode is basically like a brick wall limiter, cutting off anything above the ceiling level, while the other are a bit different. I like the intelligence tree mode the best. Even though it's the most heavy on your CPU, the sound quality will be the best. So I choose the IRC tree mode. Then a lot of people will advise you to master to -0.1 dB instead of 0 dB, just to prevent possible spikes from clipping the output. But there is a better way to solve this. Down below, where you choose the mode, is a button called Intersample Detection. This will analyze the incoming signal and make sure no peaks go over the ceiling level, thus preventing clipping when mastering to 0 dB. So let's activate that. So now it's time to set things up. The margin is basically the ceiling level, which determines how loud things are going to be. I set this to 0 dB since I want to master this to that level. Then I can start lowering the threshold until the gain reduction meter starts showing a value in a red font. This is the amount of gain reduction. I always aim for a gain reduction of about 3 dB max. Any more will start to introduce audible digital distortion, which makes the quality of the track go down. So now you can see the threshold is set to about minus 5.4 dB, while our unlimited signal was peaking at about minus 2 dB. This means that 5.4 minus 2 equals 3.4 dB, which is the maximum amount of gain reduction we're going to see in the gain reduction meter. Good. So now above the output meters we can see that the track is now peaking at 0 dB with a perceived loudness of about minus 4 dB. Minus 4 dB is about the standard when analyzing louder electronic music these days, but I've seen levels ranging from minus 15 dB to minus 3 dB for the RMS level. It just depends on the kind of music you are making. One more thing I like to talk about is the character setting. This controls the response time of the limiter. Again, you have a couple of modes to choose from, which I don't want to talk about too much since the audible effect is very minimal. But the time setting does make a difference. A slow time setting will make the limiter sound more transparent, while a fast time setting will make the limiter react much faster to the incoming signal. For loud electronic music, I like the limiter to react fast, so I keep the time at a fairly fast setting. So now the following setting I want to talk about is only needed when you're going to let your track press the vinyl, otherwise you can leave this alone. It's called dithering. Basically, dithering rounds off the jagged edges of your waveform, since these cannot be pressed to vinyl. I don't want to go too much in depth about this, but if you are mastering your track for vinyl, be sure to turn this on to prevent any problems. So now the track is pretty much done. I'll play it to you and show you one more thing I like to add to the final output to make everything even fatter and to glue everything nicely together. And I'll show you how to make the drums stand out even more by adjusting the parallel compression a bit. So while playing the track, I open up the cytomic glue compressor on the drums part. I can adjust the fatness of the drums by adjusting the makeup gain. I can also use the high pass setting to affect the low and sub frequencies. This will help to make the drums feel like they have more weight to them, resulting in a fatter track. I always do this at the end of making a track, because only then you can hear the relation between the main drums and the rest of the track. You cannot hear this before the track is finished. Simple. So I add a little bit of makeup gain to make the drums punch through a bit more, making the main drums sound more solid than before. So one thing I discovered and like to do at this point is the following. I go into the ozone limiter and take the threshold up just a little bit. This will reduce the perceived volume and make the limiting a little bit less prominent. Then afterwards I add sausage fattener with only 1 or 2% of fatness. Sausage fattener is basically a compressor and a brick wall limiter in one little package, so it will make up for the volume we lost by taking the threshold on the limiter up a bit. It will actually result in an even louder RMS level than before adding the sausage fattener. I noticed this helps to glue the final track nicely together while still maintaining the peak level of 0 dB. So that is it, the first season of Tutorial Tuesday is a wrap. The track will be online for free download from my SoundCloud page, for all you guys who want to play it in your DJ sets or who want to just analyze the track. I'm currently working on the next season of tutorials, so if you have any special requests, feel free to contact me on my forum and I'll try to implement it in the next season of tutorials. On that same forum you can also connect with other viewers, show your tracks to get some valuable feedback from me or the other members, and even show us all your other works. Soon I'll be releasing a production competition on the forum too, in which my viewers can compete each other in making a good track. The best 3 tracks will receive prizes by Loopmasters, and the best 10 tracks will be featured on my YouTube channel. You can reach the forum at www.artfx-studios.com/forum. I hope to see you there soon. Also be sure to follow me on my Twitter account, which is twitter.com/artfxstudios, or like my Facebook page on facebook.com/artfxstudios.com. See you next season.